But nonetheless, thrilled to have you here on today's episode. Monday can be challenging. Monday can be challenging for many because they're still enjoying what happened on the weekend and trying to come to terms with going back to the grind and committing themselves again to work. But let us start off this Monday well by checking in and pursuing our self growth, becoming better versions of ourselves. This, like I said, is episode 101. Uh, Today, we are starting on a bit of a different shift here in this program, and I'll tell you why it's a little bit different in just a few moments here. But there's three key pillars that are still the same, three key pillars that I celebrate and focus in on and attend to for me personally. And I share those on an ongoing basis. Any regular listener of this program will be able to recite these three pillars with me, and they'll be like, yep, I got it. And yet I still keep repeating them because they're that transformational for me. The more I reflect, the more I refresh, the more I review said pillars, the more I'm able to keep them front and center as I go through my day. Those those three key pillars being awareness, kindness, and happiness. There are so many times through the course of the day when I'm reflecting on these three key pillars, talking about them with those I get to engage with, because they make that much sense to me. They make so much sense that I'm like, this is a really important element and aspect for me. Awareness of yourselves, because most of us are not aware of ourselves the way we like to or the way that we need to know ourselves well enough to know why are we the way we are. Number two, kindness, because we struggle with being kind to ourselves. And of course, finally, the happiness piece, to be enjoyed amongst all the other emotions, which are just as legitimate and important. Welcome to the 101st episode of the Been Checkin In podcast. I'm glad to be with you for a few moments this morning in what is already for me turning out to be a busy day, but nonetheless, I wanted to touch base with you guys and check in. Now, I mentioned that there is a bit of a shift that we're taking in this program. So far, I've been helped with a list of self reflection questions that I've been working off of. And with that list of self reflection questions, I've just kind of worked my way through the list. 100 of them, we made it all the way through. And I'm thrilled about that opportunity to have experienced that. But here's the shifts we're taking now. I'm taking a shift from that list that I've been working off of. And now I'm working into a different expression of something else. So there's a meditation book that my 12-step program has. And so as I have been working through that, I'm like, hey, there's some really good themes in here. And so I'll be taking the self-reflection of the day from that meditation book and then appropriating an appropriate question from it, saying, here's one I think that would be really worth our while. And so today, I did hello, how are you, Case 1555? Nice to see you. I did the reading today. I'm like, hey, this is a really good question. And so the questions that you'll be uh, considering with me going forward are questions of my own making now. Questions of my own making after I read and have some thoughts on where those readings have taken me. Today's question goes as follows. Today's question says, what is your go to craving when you have an issue that needs to be dealt with? What is your go to craving when you have an issue that needs to be dealt with? Let me see if I can break this down for some of you who are like, what's that all about? How do I understand this question? Here's what that question entails. Most of us, I would say, thanks you 2K15, um, most of us, I think, when we are experiencing various challenges in our life, we have learned ways of how can I say? We've learned ways of distracting ourselves from focusing on the area that needs some attention. Why is this? Because when we focus on those areas that need attention, it can be uncomfortable sometimes. It can be uncomfortable to say, do I have to deal with this? This is uncomfortable. This is not in my wheelhouse. That's going to make it really something that I want to sit through. And so as a result, it can be challenging. Ross, my friend, how are you? You're saying you are feeling pretty bad today. Do I have any uplifting advice? Can I affirm you in that moment that you're experiencing? Let me affirm you because sometimes we have the sense of we have the expectation sometimes that we're not supposed to feel bad, right? We have that sense sometimes that we're like, this is not a good feeling right now. Can I avoid it? Can I feel something else other than what I'm presently feeling right now? So I can understand that, Ross. I think most of us can relate in having a terrible day. Uplifting advice is let me affirm you in that feeling because that is not a bad feeling. I don't think that's a bad feeling. I think that has some benefits for us as we're willing to walk in the midst of that feeling. And that is just part of our human experience. One of the human experiences that we have is that we're not always going to be at this high, feeling of, hey, things are going great and all right in my life. So let me affirm you in saying this is not a bad thing that you're feeling this. Uh, the normal cycle in life is ups and downs, discouragements, encouragements, discouragements, encouragements. And in the midst of those cycles, I think we have things to learn in the midst of them all. So even while you are discouraged today, even though you're feeling where you're presently at, can I ask you, what does it feel like to be in this space in this moment right now? What is it about this moment that is really making you feel the way you are? And how can you give some space for that and affirm that this is just part of life. It's not something unusual. And what can you be learning in the midst of it? Okay. So I would also like to encourage you to say it's not going to last for a long period of time. Kyle, I see you. How are you? ABC, hello. I would like to affirm you in the midst of that, saying, it's nice to know that you're not alone. So I'm with you there. I can definitely relate. I do care to see you in a happier space, but for the time being, while you are there, what does it look like for you to say, what am I going to take away from this experience here? What am I going to learn? How am I going to experience this moment here as just one of those necessary and regular parts of life? Because if we don't get used to these moments here that are uncomfortable, they become increasingly challenging in a way that we're not really helping ourselves moving forward. So, while you're there, my dear friend, just take a look around you and find out what is there to take away from this by way of benefit, including lessons that you're learning. How can you remember these moments right now, later when you're in a good season, so that you're not continuing to be in that low point? That's one of the things that I find really helpful when I'm in those zones, Ross, is to be able to say, hey, how can I acknowledge where I'm at right now and remember this for later? How can I affirm that this is just one of those experiences that is normal and legitimate in life? And as I experience them, how can I carry on a little bit further in saying, okay, how can I make the best use of this moment here? Kyle, I'm doing all right. How are you, my friend? Still, yeah, there are challenges that I'm navigating as I go through life. Can I tell you guys something? I don't, I don't have life easy, and I say that because sometimes, hey, FC, how are you? Sometimes, when people see individuals like myself and they're like, wow, that guy has things well put together, he knows his stuff, he's able to like navigate in such a way that he just seems to know what to say and he must have like no problems. Far from it. I think all of us have our fair share of struggles, and even in my context, as I experience my challenges, it's not like I have everything together. I have some unique struggles along the way that make it really challenging. Absi, it's good to see you again. How are you? Nice to have you back on here. So yes, I would also say we all are kind of in that zone of going through various experiences in life. That's why I have that third pillar in this podcast that we talk about. Again, let me just review them. Number one is awareness, awareness of ourselves. How well do we know ourselves to know how we operate in various scenarios and contexts? So important because in the absence of knowing that, then we make some decisions in life that aren't really for our benefit. They actually detract from our experience. And that is not an encouraging thing to be in the midst of. So, what does that look like for us to know ourselves well enough so that we can make the best choices for ourselves? And that can only happen if we know ourselves well enough. Number two, the kindness piece, because as we continue to know ourselves, we we've learned from our environment how to be critical of ourselves and critical not in a gracious way, but critical in a really harsh way. And so, how does that look? And then, thirdly, the happiness piece. Happiness is one I chose out of all the emotions, out of all the feelings, not because it's the most important one. I disagree with that. I think it's just one of many necessary and critical emotions. But most of us are, we know the emotions that we do not like, right? The ones that make us feel uncomfortable, like when you're called out in a crowd, for example, publicly, or when you are stressed because you don't have the answers to a problem that you're trying to sort out and you're feeling the pressure, or whatever else it is. We sort of take those emotions that lead us to jealousy, that lead us to anger, that lead us to fear, that lead us to concern. And instead of focusing and working through them, which is what's necessary, we sort of stifle them down internally. And we're like, okay, let's not focus on that. And as a result, we sort of build up this retinue internally of unprocessed emotions that stunts us in our development. And the only way for us to grow, in my perspective, is by learning to process them. And so that's why I would say, Ross, I would love to encourage you to work through those emotions, to face them, to see and savor them and say, okay, how do we move forward now, right? That's really important, I think. So I hope that encourages you, brother, that this is not unusual and that it's helpful not to be alone in the midst of it. Thank you for reaching out and asking me. I do want to encourage you saying, face it, but don't face it on your own necessarily. And that's kind of part of our question today. Our question, again, that we're answering, friends, is what is your go to craving when you have an issue that needs to be dealt with? I would argue most of us, we have a way of avoiding those things that we need to deal with. We say, I don't want to deal with this right now, so I'm going to put this on the rain check pile. I'm going to deal with this later. I don't want to address it at this present moment, even though that's maybe what I should be doing. And so we put that off indefinitely, and usually indefinitely is a very long period of time for most of us. And as we put it off, what happens is we distract ourselves with something else. We distract ourselves with something else that we find that is going to be more pleasurable. We distract ourselves with things that we're more interested in. We're more inclined to say, this is my jam. I want to focus here on this. What does that look like for us to distract ourselves with some sort of engagement that we find we may have a craving for? Now, let me give you some examples. For some people, this may be food. When you're going through something really, you've there is some there's some people who that is their go-to. They see like a um, they see like a setting in which they're like, "Ah, this is really uncomfortable," and so they express it themselves by food. I'm having some comments here saying, "Hey, what happened? You fell off bad. You used to be the TikToker, but why are you where you're at right now?" I do not know the logistics, but nonetheless, I'm not as concerned about said logistics. I'm very thankful when I do get a connection with people, and I had some amazing connections with many of my followers. And yet, for some reason, the algorithm said your time is up and you don't have this kind of access anymore. I often do hear from them when they're like, "Hey, I haven't seen you for ages, and I miss seeing your content," and that kind of thing, which is affirming in some sense because it means that there's something really important. But I do not control the algorithm, nor am I interested in fulfilling the demands of said algorithm, especially if it puts my priorities in life at risk. And so it's just one of those things. I say I may get some influence again and exposure, or I may not. But still, I'm going to try and put the best content I can out because for me, it's not the number of people that are following that is the critical part. It is more so the quality of content in which I'm putting out. And so I want to continue ensuring that that is on point. At some point, they may come back and say, "Hey, it's been a while. Let's re-engage," which I'd be thrilled for. But it's not, again, the thing that I find my sense of worth is driven by is I don't find my sense of worth any more important or less important because of how many people are following. Thanks, Test. Good to see you. Joseph, how are you? Nice to see you, my friend. So, back to the point. What is your go-to craving? I said for some it's food. They go to food as a way of distracting themselves from the present struggles that they should be addressing. And they do that indefinitely enough, and eventually that becomes a crutch. For others, it may be going to social events. They're like, how can I surround myself with people so that I don't have to focus on my struggles? How can I go and be in the places where, people are at, and the who's who? And so that's the way that they distract. They do it socially. I think to some extent that may be a little bit of mine. Other people have different ones. Maybe they just go and watch movies, or maybe they go to the casino and blow a whole bunch of money because they don't want to focus on the stuff that they should be addressing, by way of challenge in their lives. What is your go-to craving when you have an issue that needs to be dealt with? Can I suggest what seems to be another component of this question? And that is that all of us do have things to deal with. There's not one of us, I would argue, not one of us, myself included, who is able to navigate life without problems, without stuff going south, without things that are like going out of our control. Even this weekend, I had such an experience where it's like, well, that happened, and I am not thrilled about the way that happened. But I have to deal with it. I could stick my head in the sand and pretend the problem isn't there, but I know that that is not the best option for me. So, what does it look like for me to address, acknowledge that this happened, and I have to deal with it, even though it is uncomfortable to the greatest degree? It's not fun for me to have to like sort through and go through that process. It is not fun. I'd rather be doing something else. And yet, I must attend to it. And oh, this is so uncomfortable. But I know that feeling in the moment when you're like, oh, no. I didn't want this to happen, and it totally happened outside of my control, and now I have to deal with it. I think every single one of us has that kind of an experience whereby we're like, well, that happened, and I wish it didn't happen, and I didn't have any control in the way it developed and came to be. But now I must deal with it. And for many of us, we'd say, I'd rather not deal with it. I'd rather go and avoid it. So we all have stuff that we need to deal with, but we do not find said opportunities comforting. We do not find said opportunities to be something that we enjoy the process of. And so, for most of us, we sort of scale back and say, okay, how can I redirect and move away from this problem, hoping and wishing it'll just melt away. It'll just kind of disapparate, to use Harry Potter's language. It'll in some way just kind of disappear, and we won't have to be on the um, on the docket where we have to deal with it. I wish that were reality, but it's not. So most of us have things that we need to deal with. Most of us may be looking for ways of how to avoid said problem. Friends, I would totally give you the shortcuts if I knew them. As I reflect on this question, I'm thinking, how can I even simplify this for you, my listeners, as you're wrestling with this? How can I sort of make ends meet in such a way where it'll be like, okay, this is helpful and noteworthy as we move forward out of this scenario in such a way where it's like, okay, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and here's the shortcuts. If there's a shortcut, I would happily tell you what the shortcut is, happily. However, I find that whenever I'm giving advice, it's a really hard piece of advice that I usually give. A hard piece of advice because I know the shortcuts and I know the promise the shortcuts offer, but I also know very intimately how empty the destination is when we pursue the shortcut routes, when we pursue taking or cutting corners. And I don't find them compelling from my experience, I walked down those roads and it's like, this is not a good idea. And so I'm not going to take this. And so I want to present to you the best that I have of my insights, the best. And yet, as I share the best that I have, I'm reflecting often how that is, it's the hard path that we need to walk. It seems as we pursue trying to be better versions of ourselves, the shortcuts really are, they're not as satisfying. Actually, they're not satisfying at all in my perspective. They're actually far more devastating. And so when I share my insights or advice with people, it's usually the hard bits of encouragement that I'm giving. And as I give those, there's something in me that's saying, "Oh, I wish this could be easier. I wish I could have access to something that's easier." But from all that I've tried, I haven't found any of them compelling. So, even as we look at this question here, friends, it is tough um, advice that I'm going to give you and myself of how we navigate through issues that need to be dealt with that we are tempted to avoid by going to decoys, by going to other areas. Bella says, "Morning, Benny. I've been starting my morning with you in my ear lately, and I thank you. I'm so grateful, Bella. I'm glad that this is serving you. That's why I love making myself available this way. So thank you for listening in, Bella. I super appreciate that. I appreciate you as well as all of you guys who are my regulars on here. I I'm grateful for you because we are aligned on what we feel is important. Not everyone's on the same wavelength. There's some who'll come by and listen and say, this is dry, this is dull, because they're not on the same wavelength. They're not in the same scenario or season of life as we are. We're only here because we've come to appreciate the value that focusing on these moments and the things that we talk about are going to help us in our context. But not everyone's there. Other people have different lessons. There are different pathways that they need to go through eventually to grow to be the next version of themselves. Maybe this is not a priority for them. And so I'm super grateful for each of you guys who's able to enjoy these moments with me, to wrestle through these moments with me and say, here's why we find this beneficial. So yeah, like I was saying, friends, I wish there was the easier option that I could offer you and saying, hey, this could go a lot easier, a lot better, a lot more, with a lot more comfort. I wish there was. I wish there were shortcuts that were compelling and actually worked, but uh, I don't think there are. I don't think there are. I haven't experienced them. So I'm going to show you the best, which makes, which not, it does make us, but it proposes the road less traveled, the road that's a lot rockier, the road that's a lot more intimidating, the road that takes a lot more energy. And yet, as we go through and navigate through those pathways together, we actually come out far stronger because we did the work that was necessary to do. Again, the question I'm answering, I'm going to jump to my answer now. What is your go to craving when you have an issue that needs to be dealt with? What's the way that you distract yourself when you have stuff on your radar that you know you need to attend to? For me, here's what it is. For me, my go to is isolation. Isolation. Now, people look at me and say, "You're super social." I know I am. You're really gifted at connecting with people. Yes. And yet, even I come across circumstances and scenarios where I'm like, I don't want to deal with this today. This is actually really challenging. I would rather just tap out here and substitute for a different reality because right now this is not fun. I too experience what that's like. And in the midst of that, as I reflect on it, oh, I can still feel that sense of dread inside me internally where it's like, I don't want to go there. And yet, for me, as I address that this is the dynamic or the scenario, one of the things I'm aware of, one of the things I'm aware of is that I need to deal with it. If I know that something is not figured out here, I need to work through it. So for me, my distraction that I usually go to is I isolate myself from people. I isolate myself because in the place of isolation, I don't have to address or go through it. I can just sort of zone out and think of something else. When I'm around people, I still have that thing in my mind. It's unsettling. I'm not myself usually. I'm not as engaging. I'm not as present. And so I try to take myself away from that context being around people because they can tell, then, something's up and I don't want to be called out. I'd rather, stay longer because when I get called out, then I know I have to address it. So I want to isolate myself so that I can sort of procrastinate more. And usually that takes a couple of different ways for me. A couple of different ways and expressions that takes is when I isolate, I'll watch a movie, for example, or I'll watch a TV series. Also, I'll sort of just zone out. I'll just sort of like disengage. It's not a happy place when I do that, but it's a little bit of a relief saying, I'm going to give myself a break from this. Now, whatever that craving is that you like to indulge, whether it's food, whether it's company like me, or isolation like me, or whether it's social dynamics for you, or whatever what else expression it takes. It's not to say that that is a bad thing. If you enjoy food, but enjoy it within moderation, right? But don't make that the place you go to avoid your problems. Don't do whatever it is that your craving is for the sake of avoiding whatever it is you need to address. Sometimes it may mean that you are just gonna disengage for a moment or two while you just catch your breath, right? While you are able to say, okay, how can I in this moment here do what I need to do by way of recalibrating? How can I just give myself just a bit of a break, just a bit of a break so that I can recenter yourself. That's I think something worthwhile doing in a good way. However, however, I would say even as you consider that alternative, what does it look like, however, for you to still proceed in facing those circumstances and dynamics that are drawing you to disconnect, to be able to say, nope, I'm tapping out here. I think this is something that most of us may struggle with in some way. And so today's question is an opportunity to look under the hood and say, what are some of those things in my present context that I am avoiding actively so that I can go a different way, so that I can experience something different? What would those be in your context? For me, like I said, it's checking out, going into isolation. And so one of the things I've done now is when I'm tempted to do that, I go in the opposite direction. I go in the opposite direction. There's a few ways that I try and serve myself in this capacity. Now, one of the things I do is I walk back towards community. Who are my safe people that I can talk to and share about anything that's on the radar, especially with reference to the fact that I found it super uncomfortable for, right? How can I walk towards that very thing where I was like, this is uncomfortable and I want to face that? How can I surround myself around people who are going to hold me accountable? They're not going to hold me accountable in a mean way. They're not going to like say, hey, and push me off the ledge, but they're going to challenge me with some questions. They're going to walk alongside me and affirm me and say, hey, this is tough, but this is worthwhile. This is good. Walk towards it, right? What are some books that I could be reading that I may have found challenging and helpful in the past to help me get back into that mind space that says, even though this is uncomfortable, I'm still going to walk through towards it? What are some voices I'm going to listen to by way of podcasts or shows that remind me of who I want to be and how I want to go down that pathway? This is an intentional thing and it's a courageous thing. It's a courageous thing, my dear listener, if you are in that space where you have to face yourself in the mirror and challenge yourself to say, do the hard thing, take the hard step, and grow. Grow in the midst of those opportunities where most would say, I'm checking out, and they continue to remain stunted. The reason we do this podcast, the reason I do this podcast, the reason you're listening in is because it does matter to us. Knowing ourselves well enough, how can we become more aware of who we are and how we're operating, especially when we have those opportunities to make those decisions that are uncomfortable? Oh, how can we be kind to ourselves in the midst of doing that? How can we show ourselves patience while we are growing? Because that is what it means to be human, for us to grow in a way that says, hey, I don't have it together, but I don't have to, because that's what it means to be human, that we are messy going forward, but what we're learning and growing as a result. And then how can we make space for that elusive happiness, that deep sense of happiness that comes when we know that we're in the right place at the right time, doing the things that we need to be doing at the time that we need to be doing them, instead of checking out and pursuing cravings that distract and keep us in that space where we are not really growing to the next best version of ourselves. That's what I got for you today, my dear friends. Thank you so much for tuning into this 101st episode. I look forward to touching base with you tomorrow. Have a fantastic Monday. Love you guys. Bye.